Tonight, we begin with a development that Western intelligence officials had feared, defense analysts had tracked, and the international community had quietly prepared for, a move that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours, hours that changed the calculus of this conflict, hours that forced an immediate response from Kyiv, hours that left the entire world wondering just how far Moscow is willing to go. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that NATO leaders had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with precision, with defiance, and with a message so clear that even the Kremlin was forced to take notice. This is not a story about threats. This is a story about what happens when those threats are answered. And tonight, the answer from Ukraine shocked everyone. For several weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal diplomatic communiques, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unusual. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Washington, London, and Brussels this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence officials who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators, the movement of strategic assets toward forward positions, the unusual concentration of command and control aircraft, the activation of deep strike missile battalions, the sudden cessation of routine military communications. All of that went quiet, and whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Western satellites tracked unusual activity near known nuclear storage facilities in Belgorod Oblast. Electronic surveillance picked up encrypted bursts from mobile command units that had been dormant for months. And sources within Allied intelligence agencies began sharing the same assessment. Russia was preparing to escalate, not marginally, but dramatically. The question was never if, the question was when. And the answer came today. Early this morning, Pentagon officials detected what they described as unprecedented strategic positioning, including the deployment of nuclear-capable Iskander-M missile systems that had not been moved to forward positions in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: deterrence, coercion, or preparation for use. Intelligence analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategic posture. And when a nuclear power shifts posture without explanation, even by a small measure, the entire Western alliance pays attention. The movement was accompanied by something even more alarming. Russian state television broadcast a statement from Putin himself, unscheduled, unannounced, and delivered in tones that even seasoned Kremlin watchers described as unusually aggressive. Putin warned that any further strikes on Russian territory would be met with, quote, responses of a nature the West has not yet contemplated. He invoked Russia's nuclear doctrine, he referenced the survivability of the Russian state, and he made specific mention of Ukraine's Western-supplied long-range capabilities. This was not the language of diplomacy, this was the language of ultimatum. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Officials after emergency meetings described Putin's move as reckless, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, inconsistent with any genuine interest in de-escalation. But nuclear threats only work if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, Zelensky's response today was among the most decisive we've seen since the earliest days of this war. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of Putin's televised address, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated strike campaign that stunned military observers. These weren't the limited defensive operations that characterized earlier phases of the conflict. These were deep penetration strikes, precision-guided systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to reshape the battlefield. Zelensky understood something that many in the West are still learning. You cannot negotiate with escalation by stepping back. You can only answer it by stepping forward. And that is exactly what Ukraine did today. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on high-value Russian targets, including a logistics hub in Kursk Oblast that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a major offensive push. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit ammunition depots, they hit command nodes, they hit radar installations that were likely preparing to guide incoming missile attacks. In other words, Ukraine targeted the operational infrastructure of Russian escalation, the backbone that would have made Putin's threat actionable. This is what made the White House warning so urgent. Putin's nuclear posturing wasn't just symbolic, it was tactical. It represented the kind of move that could freeze Western support if left unchecked. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian areas. They didn't engage in indiscriminate retaliation. They hit military infrastructure. They hit the systems designed to threaten them. And they did so with a level of precision that left even Western allies quietly impressed. Reports now indicate that Ukrainian strikes damaged or destroyed at least 14 confirmed Russian military targets in the span of 8 hours. This included 3 S-400 air defense batteries that had been repositioned to cover the Kursk-Belgorod corridor, a fuel distribution network that supplied Russian armored columns, and a forward airfield that intelligence analysts had flagged as a likely staging point for tactical aviation sorties. Ukraine didn't just respond. They responded in a way that degraded Russia's ability to execute the very escalation Putin had threatened. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest threat was designed to test the resolve of the Western alliance after months of political uncertainty and delayed military aid. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would waver, whether European capitals would fracture, whether Kyiv would blink, but instead the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't blink. They responded with a counter-offensive operation that was so rapid, so coordinated, that even Russian military bloggers acknowledged the damage. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, Zelensky did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Putin's gambit as a stress test, a way to probe the seams of Western unity. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their operations were not only effective, they were calibrated so precisely that they avoided the kind of escalation triggers that Putin could use to justify further action. That calibration matters because it shows operational maturity. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian aggression. They are anticipating it. They are preparing for it. They are defeating it before it can materialize. And in doing so, they are demonstrating something that the Kremlin desperately hoped would erode over time: competence under pressure, resolve in the face of intimidation, and a strategic discipline that refuses to be baited. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force units carried out long-range drone sorties, forcing Russian air defenses into defensive postures across 3 oblasts. Ground-based missile teams targeted rail infrastructure that had been upgraded in the last 6 months for ammunition transport. Cyber units operating in coordination with kinetic forces reportedly disrupted communications networks used by Russian commanders to coordinate troop movements. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just defense, this was operational dominance. This was strategic messaging. And strategic messaging is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the early days of this invasion. For every advance Moscow has made, Ukraine has countered with something that undermines the narrative of Russian inevitability. Every time Putin declares victory, Ukraine demonstrates capability. Every time Moscow claims momentum, Kyiv answers with precision. And tonight was no exception. Remember, Putin thought Ukraine would fall in 3 days. They thought Zelensky would flee. They thought the West would abandon Kyiv after the first winter. They thought sanctions would cripple only the Western economies. They thought time was on their side. But tonight, the exact opposite is playing out. Ukraine is striking deeper than ever before. Western support remains steady despite political turbulence, and Putin's threats are being answered not with fear, but with action. This is not the war Russia planned. This is not the outcome Moscow anticipated. And the longer it continues, the more difficult it becomes for Putin to claim success. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Putin's latest threat happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Russian military hardliners want total mobilization. Oligarchs want sanctions relief. Nationalist voices want nuclear action. Pragmatists want a negotiated exit. Putin is balancing these competing demands while managing a war that has now cost Russia hundreds of thousands of casualties, decimated its tank fleet, and exposed the limitations of its military doctrine. And when leaders in that position make sudden aggressive moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because the alternative, admitting failure, is politically unacceptable. Tonight's threat was not a sign of Russian power. It was a sign of Russian desperation, and Zelensky's response made that desperation visible to the entire world. The White House's condemnation, now circulating across international news networks, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow nuclear blackmail to dictate the terms of this conflict. Senior officials said plainly that Putin's escalation was inconsistent with responsible nuclear stewardship. That is diplomatic language for this is reckless and we are watching. You don't usually hear that tone from the National Security Council unless something serious is at stake. Simultaneously, NATO Secretary General issued a statement reaffirming the alliance's commitment to collective defense and its support for Ukrainian sovereignty. The message was clear: Russia's threats will not splinter Western unity, they will reinforce it. Meanwhile, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a calm, resolute speech tonight. He said, "We do not seek war, but we will never accept occupation." He said, "Russia's threats are designed to frighten, but Ukraine does not frighten easily." And he said, "Every time they escalate, we demonstrate that escalation has consequences." Tonight was one of those demonstrations. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's tone was measured. His words were deliberate, and his message was unmistakable. Ukraine will not be intimidated. Ukraine will not surrender, and Ukraine will continue to fight on its terms, not Moscow's. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's threat tonight wasn't isolated. Along with the nuclear signaling, Belarusian forces also increased activity along the northern border. Russian Navy vessels repositioned in the Black Sea near Crimea. Iranian-supplied drone deliveries reportedly increased, targeting Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 48-hour window. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means a coordinated pressure campaign. It means an attempt to stretch Ukrainian defenses across multiple fronts. And it means that tonight's response was not just about one threat, but about demonstrating that Ukraine can answer all of them. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a winter offensive designed to capture remaining objectives in Donetsk and Luhansk. Another is that Russia is attempting to create conditions for a frozen conflict, locking in territorial gains before potential diplomatic engagement. A third possibility, the one worrying Western officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to fracture the Western alliance by demonstrating that continued support carries escalation risks. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't pause operations. They didn't request emergency consultations. They didn't issue statements calling for calm. They struck. And in striking, they sent a message: nuclear threats will not paralyze Ukraine. They will only harden Ukrainian resolve. What we're watching now is a test of wills. Putin wants to see whether fear can accomplish what force has not. Zelensky wants to show that Ukraine's spirit cannot be broken. NATO wants to prevent this conflict from spiraling into broader confrontation, and the international community wants to prevent the normalization of nuclear blackmail. These competing objectives are colliding in real time, and the stakes could not be higher. Tonight, we've heard from senior defense officials who are now monitoring Russian force dispositions around the clock. They say Russian strategic forces have not moved to higher alert levels yet. They say communications intercepts suggest confusion within Russian command structures about how to respond to Ukraine's counterstrikes. And they say Putin's decision to escalate rhetoric was likely part of a broader psychological campaign intended to weaken Western resolve ahead of upcoming support decisions. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, targeted, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that threats will be answered, and it sent a message to Washington, London, and Brussels that Ukraine remains a capable and determined partner. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with tonight's threat. But what we do know is that Zelensky's response was timely. It demonstrated capability, it preserved deterrence, and it reminded the world that Ukraine refuses to be a victim. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming days. If he escalates further, this moment will be remembered as a turning point. If he steps back, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared for either outcome. They have shown they are ready to defend. They have shown they are ready to respond, and they have shown that the only path to peace runs through strength, not submission. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet, and when Putin is quiet after an unanswered gambit, it means he is thinking. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something that he has refused to accept since February of 2022. Ukraine will not break. The West will not abandon them. And nuclear threats will not rewrite the terms of this conflict. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Zelensky shocked everyone. Putin's bluff was called. And the world is watching what happens next. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase of this historic conflict unfolds.